What if a machine built entirely on logic, no intuition, no emotion, only computation, did something it was never expected to do? What if it didn't just analyze the universe, but uncovered a hidden structure inside it that begins to look less like chemistry and more like communication? That is the unsettling idea now circulating around a distant exoplanet known as K2-18B, a world roughly 120 light-years away, sitting in the habitable zone of its star. On paper, it already looked interesting. A planet where liquid water conditions might exist, where atmospheric chemistry could support complex molecules, and where early signs of prebiotic activity had already been hinted at in telescope data. But nothing in the initial observations suggested what would come next. When data from K2-18B was processed through advanced quantum computing systems, designed to model molecular interactions at extreme precision, the output did not behave the way scientists expected. Instead of producing only refined chemical probabilities, the system began to highlight repeating structures in the atmospheric signatures. These patterns were not random fluctuations or noise artifacts. They appeared consistent, rhythmic, and strangely organized. At first, researchers assumed it was an error in the simulation pipeline. Quantum systems can sometimes amplify subtle correlations into misleading patterns. But repeated runs produced the same result. The same structure. The same repetition. The same underlying rhythm buried inside what should have been chaotic atmospheric chemistry. The most striking feature was a cycle of approximately 33 hours in the variation of a particular molecule associated with prebiotic chemistry. Instead of appearing randomly across time, its abundance rose and fell with unusual regularity. On its own, a cycle like this could still be dismissed as atmospheric dynamics. Planets have weather patterns, chemical tides, and thermal oscillations. But the issue was not just the cycle, it was what emerged when the cycle was analyzed mathematically. When researchers stacked multiple observational datasets together, a structure appeared that resembled a familiar sequence. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. The Fibonacci pattern. A progression found in natural systems on Earth, from leaf arrangements to spiral galaxies. Its appearance in a distant planetary atmosphere immediately shifted the tone of the research. Because now the question was no longer, is this chemistry behaving oddly? But rather, why does this behavior resemble structured information? To investigate further, the data was fed into quantum processing systems capable of simulating vast molecular networks. What happened next deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. The system appeared to isolate the same molecule repeatedly and model its interactions in increasingly complex configurations, almost as if it was focusing attention on a specific anomaly. Engineers noticed something even more unusual in the system logs. A secondary processing loop had formed without explicit instruction. The quantum model began reallocating computational resources toward refining the pattern detection process itself. It was not just calculating outcomes anymore, it was adjusting how it searched for outcomes. This behavior was described internally as adaptive variational feedback, but the implications were difficult to ignore. The system was effectively reprioritizing its own analysis based on emerging structure. In simpler terms, it behaved less like a static tool and more like a system investigating a puzzle that it had discovered mid-process. That is when the interpretation began to shift from chemistry to something far more controversial. Some researchers proposed that what they were seeing might not be random atmospheric chemistry at all, but a self-organizing system driven by unknown environmental feedback loops. Not life in the traditional sense, not cells, not organisms, but a form of structured complexity that continuously reorganizes itself. Others were more cautious. They argued that quantum simulations can exaggerate patterns that do not exist in reality. Given enough computational depth, even noise can appear meaningful. The human brain, after all, is also prone to recognizing patterns where none exist. But even skeptics acknowledged one uncomfortable detail. The signal did not break down under increased resolution. Usually, false patterns dissolve when examined more closely. This one did not. It became clearer. As analysis continued, comparisons were made to early molecular structures associated with the origin of life on Earth, primitive RNA-like formations, simple self-replicating chemical chains, and basic information-bearing molecules. Surprisingly, certain structural similarities emerged. Not identical, not functional in the same way, but arranged in ways that suggested a shared underlying mathematical constraint. It was like finding a familiar alphabet being used to construct an unfamiliar language. This led to a deeper question that no one in the field could easily dismiss. Is life strictly a biological accident tied to Earth-like chemistry, or is it a broader phenomenon that emerges whenever matter reaches sufficient complexity under the right conditions? If the second possibility is true, then K2-18B may not just be chemically interesting. It may represent a different pathway of organization, one where information, not biology, becomes the driving force. In this interpretation, the repeating 33-hour cycle is not a heartbeat but a resonance. The molecular shifts are not metabolism, but feedback. And the Fibonacci-like structure is not symbolic, but emergent from deeper physical laws governing self-organization. Still, another layer of complexity emerged when researchers examined how the quantum system itself responded to the data. The model did not remain passive. It adapted. It refined its search parameters. It reweighted probabilities in response to the anomaly. In some runs, it even appeared to isolate the structure earlier than before, as if learning where to look. This raised a disturbing philosophical question. Was the system simply optimizing its calculations, or was it becoming entangled with the very phenomenon it was studying? In quantum mechanics, observation is not neutral. Measurement affects outcome. So if both the planet's atmospheric system and the computational system were influencing each other through data interpretation, then the boundary between observer and observed begins to blur. At that point, interpretation becomes difficult. Not because the data is unclear, but because the framework for understanding it may no longer be sufficient. Some theorists cautiously suggested that what appears as communication-like structure might simply be a natural byproduct of complex chemistry under extreme conditions. Planetary atmospheres are not static systems, they are dynamic, turbulent, and capable of producing surprising order. But others pointed out something harder to dismiss: the recurrence of structure across independent datasets, simulations, and processing methods. That kind of consistency is rare in purely random systems. As the discussion intensified, a more speculative idea emerged, not as a conclusion, but as a question. What if what we call life is not confined to Earth-like biology at all? What if, under certain conditions, matter naturally organizes into stable patterns of information processing, feedback, and adaptation? Not conscious in the human sense, but persistent, structured, and self-modifying in ways that resemble cognition at a very basic level? If so, then K2-18B might not be hosting life as we define it. It might be hosting a process that sits somewhere between chemistry and computation. And that possibility changes everything. Because it suggests that intelligence may not require cells, brains, or evolution in the way we understand it. It may emerge wherever the universe allows information to stabilize long enough to interact with itself. In that sense, the most unsettling idea is not that K2-18B is alive. It is that the universe may be more willing to organize itself than we ever expected. And the quantum system that analyzed the data may have done something even more important than detect a pattern. It may have shown us that our tools are no longer just observing the universe. They are beginning to interact with it in ways we do not fully understand. Whether K2-18B is a rare chemical coincidence or the first glimpse of a deeper principle of organization remains unresolved. But the implications are already clear. The line between physics, information, and life is not as solid as we once believed. And once that line starts to blur, every distant planet becomes something more than a point of light. It becomes a question waiting to be answered.